Uh, um, I'm just noticing a comment here. Alida van der Vaart is asking, have you engaged with MASH 2006, the effects of a language barrier in a South African district hospital, on how English takes a normative space and no official policy deals with giving Xhosa speakers access to standardized interpreting services, meaning that, as the author notes, many leave the hospital without knowing the diagnosis or not knowing why they are being treated and what their choices and options are.
I haven't seen MASH 2006, no, but that, Alida, that it doesn't actually surprise me that kind of an epistemic violence would be happening. It happens so often. And also, I mean, we're in a country with the majority language is definitely not English. I think the majority language, the last I checked, was Zulu. And it's just remarkable that we have to be still grappling with those kinds of violences. But if I think about our history, it kind of makes sense to me. I somehow am feeling a little bit more at home with why it is that somebody can be treated so badly, so awfully. It's because how we are figured, how Blackness and Black life is figured in the archive is unremarkable. We're not counted. So why would it matter whether or not we leave the doctor's office knowing my correct diagnosis? Because I'm so used to reading you as a throwaway. So, for example, this another snapshot from the syphilis epidemic. I'll just quickly read it here. It says, which is also crazy that the mine workers, Alan Jeeves says, the mine workers were the lucky ones. And I think that was also sort of a cynical jab he was making. Other employees also dismissed workers when they became sick, offering no treatment at all. Black miners who failed the state-mandated mine medical examinations, termed mine medical rejects, found work, if at all, among the country's worst employers, such as the Zululand sugar estates and the railway contractors there. Typically disabled, emaciated, or merely chronically sick, those workers, when completely unable to function, were simply ejected from the compounds. They died in numbers along the public roads and in railway stations and carriages. The Department of Public Health senior official in Durban termed these unfortunates human trash and objected when their treatment was charged to public funds. So it's these kinds of, when you see in the archive, and that's also why I love archival work, it's just kind of this work of surfacing, bringing back into conversation things that might slip underneath the radar, right? So if in the 1930s and 40s, you had people who were just left on the wayside to die, like this idea that Yasmin Ibrahim talks about, Black death as a banal encounter. That's why you can just leave the person to walk out without knowing what their diagnosis is. Thank you for that comment. I think it adds to the discussion, Alida.
Absolutely. And I as having read the comment and as you're speaking, I'm just thinking as well of the extension of this notion of epistemic violence, of how is then this logging of Black matter and Black bodies, how is it then reused or repurposed for the value of those people who need it? Going back to the film, for me, one of the statements that the young lady immediately says, when she says, "I was a mom," for me, that kept ringing in my head throughout the film. And had she had that knowledge, had she been afforded those opportunities, going back as well to the comment about translation and putting that knowledge to use in ways that can at least try to chip at this violence. It's making me think of that. But at the same time, thinking about how we teach courses like medical anthropology, and how, ironically, in some instances, we can over textualize the courses we teach. And ironically, the body can be missing in these courses. And it's making me think about, how, especially as part of this decolonial project that we're undertaking in with knowledge, how that can be factored into all of this.
Yeah. It always, I think I was so profoundly, there've been a number of entry points into all of this, starting from from when I was around like 7 years old. But, when I watched Ava DuVernay's documentary limited series, When They See Us, and I don't know if people here have seen it. It was or still is available on Netflix. And it's about the Central Park Five, the 5 young boys who were sentenced to life imprisonment for the supposed assault and rape of a white woman. And it was found 25 years later that they were innocent because the perpetrator came forward. In fact, he was an inmate at the anyway. I mean, it's a well aired story. But what Ava DuVernay does in her documentary is such a stellar job, and I highly recommend people go watch it. And particularly, it was the titling that really grabbed me. When They See Us. So it kind of moves the conversation away from how, which I think we're very occupied in accounting for how racism lays claim to people's lives and how systematic it is. And we talk about the how. And it's very rare that we get an account of the when. We do the why, the what, we do the how, the why, the what, but very rarely the when. And it's this titling, When They See Us, that kind of that presents a priori that they are differences, they are differences that are there, and that we're living through these differences every day. So just so that everybody wasn't aware, when they see us, it doesn't matter if you are a child, because they were children when they were convicted, 12 years old. They were seen as wiling out. I think they were seen as wildlings. You're 12. I don't know if anybody has children or is in proximation with young people. When you're 12, you're so tiny. You're to imagine a 12-year-old as a wilderness, as a wild thing. In the worst sense of the word wild, because also people think, it's quite nice to be this wild child. No, there's nothing about it that's fantastic for a Black person to be called wild. So yeah, I think it's important to attend to these figurations in the archive.
Absolutely. Are there any other comments or questions? And while we're waiting, I think I have 2 further questions for you. The one is, how might we, or rather, when might these snapshots be productive of new possibilities? What are your thoughts on that? And you've spoken about the archive, but I also found myself wondering, where is this archive? So those are my 2 questions.
I would be cautious of, I talk about it in 1 or 2 papers. I'm hedging on this like transformative moment. And I think the decolonial turn is always like seeking to transform. But before we can transform, I don't know, I think that based on this density, until we're all on the same page, until we're all in absolute awareness that the way in which we organize ourselves in society is racist. It's racist, it's sexist, it's gendered. It's all of these things. And until we can just be really sort of sober about it and non-attached and non-defensive, non-attached is the wrong word, non-defensive about it, we can possibly start having the conversation. What that transformation will look like, we have no idea. Afrofuturism does a great job in imagining things. Futurist thinking does a great job in imagining new things. But before we jump into this idea of futurism, I just wish everybody was on the same page, that when I walk into a space, that it's a given that we're all read in different ways, and that these differences mean something. So there's a text by a couple, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, by Robin DiAngelo. It's a great text to read. Then there's Rainy Edo Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. So there are all of these texts, and there's Efua Hirsch's work, which is just phenomenal. Olusogun, David Olusogun also does great work there. So I think before we can transform, I just think that it should be far more mediated, that we shouldn't wait for incidences where people's belongings get urinated on, or this, these outlying crazy, and they're also not outlying, that these things don't have to happen. And also if and when they do happen, it doesn't become like a hotspot that you attend to in the moment, and then we leave the conversation, that one is only talking about race when there's an event that happens. We must all understand that race is part of our society. There's not one person in South Africa, not one person in South Africa who doesn't have a subconscious bias based on race, racial discriminations. And by discriminations, I mean, based on racial discernments, I should say. We all have a subconscious bias based on racial discernments if you are South African. But this, of course, is a very provocative statement to make, right? But the important thing is to talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's build a vocabulary about it. And then, sorry, I've kind of lost track of your second question, which was...
I was asking about the archive.
The archive.
Yeah.
Where is it? So I've particularly chosen like the traditional archive. So, enslaved, previously like slave records, the slave office. But also there's, in some ways it probably is a bit simpler in disciplines like history, in disciplines like public health, in disciplines like sociology, anthropology. Actually, no, and now I'm mentioning all the disciplines. It's actually pretty easy to have an archive. You just have to look at all of the publications. So this one by Jeeves, he's writing about the syphilis epidemic. Not only would we have a record of the one thing that the colonial officers did fantastically was to create a record. So you can always rely on that record to situate things. And of course, in the early 1910s, late 1800s, people wrote very candidly about the Bantu population, the colored people, white people. It wasn't seen as something that was problematic. So all of these terms are there for the taking. It's all there in our libraries. And I know that universities are elitist spots, but the National Archives are not. The National Archive is a national utility. You just go in there and you can access all of this stuff, all of this recording. It takes time, of course, but it's all available. It's all there. And there's a lot of work if you want to surface the archive. But yeah, I think it's just about being creative. It's about being critical and asking that question, why? I always love to share that with some of my students, is that just keep asking yourself why. So if my grandmother was silent on on her story, I say, why, Makulu? And she just, she just disengaged with me at that moment. But I then would go back to myself, like ask myself, why is there a silence on this? And then I say, oh, maybe there's a silence because it's too painful. Then it makes me think, okay, how do people record pain? Then I find this article about during World War II amongst the Japanese sex slaves who were taken from Korea, and it took them 85 years for women to first talk about that. When they were 85. So it took them 65 years for them to articulate the kinds of atrocities that they experienced in these camps. And so, there's definitely something there about trauma. And then, of course, there's, Tabiseng Motseme's The Mute Always Speak, that even in muted moments, based on the TRC, that the silence is also speaking. And that's an example of this rendering of opacity. So the archive is there. It's in all of us. We are the archive. Ask the question, why? Why is it that the security guard follows me when I go into a shop? Why is it that when I'm walking, and this is based on an experience that a friend had, that you're constantly walking, and it might be subconscious to you until you hear it from someone else. But as a Black person, you're constantly managing the microaggressions, but also constantly in this performance of de-arming yourself in the face of whiteness. So somebody related the story to me where they felt that they needed to perform that they're not a danger to this little white boy who looked at them and perceived them as a danger just because they were Black. And then they remarked that, in that moment, I realized that I hadn't yet conveyed to that little person that I wasn't a danger. And it's that kind of this like multiple levels of existence that Black life has to do on a daily basis. How many masks do we have to wear, and how many performances do we have to enact in every moment? Am I making so I'm discharging this moment from this perceived violence this white person has? Whose space am I walking to? How do I perform or duplicate? There's just so many things that you're questioning, and you walk into your school. Was I given that job because I was Black? Am I treated in this way because I was Black? You're constantly asking yourself this question. This is such an exhaustion, this mental slavery, really. Yeah. So I think I'm just blabbing now.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think I could carry on talking about this forever. But as you said, the archive is porous and transmutable. And I think for me, that's also another thing that I'm going to sit with and try to understand as I walk and I occupy spaces. And I too have found myself disarming moments. And on that note, I just want to encourage our participants to go back and check out The Shape of Motherhood. I think it's a very interesting and thought-provoking piece, and particularly after this talk, I think it will ring differently for people as they engage with it.
Thank you so much for your generosity, Melusi. Much appreciated for the platform and the time, and for everyone listening. Thank you so much for being there to listen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prah, and thank you everyone for attending. Have a good afternoon.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Bye.